I. George 1714 to 1727. To understand the significance of King George I's reign, we must first delve into a concise overview of his time on the British throne. George I, born in Hanover, Germany, in 1660, was the first monarch of the House of Hanover to rule over Great Britain. His reign spanned from 1714 to 1727, making it a relatively short period in the grand tapestry of British history. George I ascended to the throne following the death of Queen Anne, marking a pivotal moment in British history. His rule marked the beginning of the Hanoverian era, succeeding the tumultuous years of the Stuart dynasty. George I's reign was characterized by a complex blend of political intrigue, cultural evolution, and international diplomacy. George I's reign holds a unique and crucial place in British history for several reasons. Firstly, it represented a critical juncture in the evolution of the British monarchy. His accession marked the transition from the Stuart dynasty to the House of Hanover, a change driven by the Act of Settlement and the desire for a Protestant monarch. This shift in royal lineage had far-reaching consequences for the structure of British governance and the monarchy's relationship with Parliament. Secondly, George I's reign was marked by a delicate balance of power between the monarch and the emerging role of prime ministers. This period saw the beginnings of the prime ministerial system as we know it today, with influential figures such as Robert Walpole wielding significant authority. The dynamic between the king and his ministers set the stage for a new era of constitutional monarchy in which the monarch's powers were gradually ceded to elected representatives. George I, born Georg Ludwig on May 28, 1660, in Hanover, was a member of the House of Hanover, a German noble family with strong ties to the British royal family. His family's lineage could be traced back to George's great-grandmother, Anne of Denmark, the daughter of King James VI and First of England and Scotland. This genealogical connection made George I a legitimate heir to the English throne, as per the Act of Settlement 1701, which stipulated that only Protestants from the House of Hanover could succeed to the throne. Prior to his ascent to the English throne, George I held the titles of Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg and Elector of Hanover, which placed him among the European nobility. His upbringing was influenced by the cultural and political dynamics of the Holy Roman Empire, and he received a well-rounded education suitable for a future ruler. George's path to the English throne was intricately tied to the political maneuvering and religious tensions of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had established the principle of constitutional monarchy and religious toleration in England. This revolution resulted in the joint rule of William III and Mary II, and later, Mary's sister, Queen Anne, ascended to the throne. When Queen Anne died in 1714 without a direct heir, the English crown faced a succession crisis. The Act of Settlement 1701, which excluded Catholic descendants of James II from the throne, led to the selection of George I as her successor. George's mother, Sophia of Hanover, was Anne's closest Protestant relative, and upon her death, George became the closest eligible heir. However, the transition of power was not without challenges. There were political factions within England, such as the Tories and Whigs, who had differing views on the monarchy and the role of Parliament. George I was primarily supported by the Whigs, who favored a stronger parliamentary role in governance. His ascent was met with opposition from Jacobite sympathizers who sought to restore the Stuart line, as well as religious dissenters who were wary of his Lutheran faith. These complexities set the stage for a turbulent start to his reign. George I's succession to the English throne was met with a mix of anticipation and skepticism. His limited knowledge of the English language and unfamiliarity with English customs created a sense of foreignness that some found difficult to accept. Additionally, the transition of power was marked by political tensions, as the Whigs sought to consolidate their influence in the government while the Tories resisted. One of the most notable controversies of George I's early reign was the South Sea Bubble, a financial scandal that saw the collapse of the South Sea Company's stock prices, resulting in significant financial losses for many investors. While George I himself was not directly involved, the scandal tarnished the reputation of his government and led to a re-evaluation of financial regulation in England. The first years of George I's reign were marked by political strife and suspicion, but over time, he established himself as a relatively stable and moderate monarch, paving the way for the development of constitutional monarchy in Britain. His reign also saw the emergence of influential political figures like Robert Walpole, who would play a pivotal role in the evolution of the British parliamentary system. The Act of Settlement, passed by the English Parliament in 1701, was a pivotal piece of legislation that played a central role in determining the succession of the British monarchy. Its primary aim was to secure a Protestant succession by explicitly excluding Roman Catholics from the line of succession. The act stipulated that only Protestants, particularly descendants of Sophia of Hanover, could inherit the English throne. Exclusion of Catholics. The act firmly excluded any Roman Catholic from the throne, regardless of their position in the line of succession. This was a direct response to the religious tensions and conflicts that had plagued England for centuries, particularly the Catholic-Protestant struggles during the reign of the Stuart monarchs. Preference for a Protestant monarch. By favoring Sophia of Hanover and her Protestant descendants, the act aimed to ensure that the English monarchy remained in Protestant hands. This was seen as a safeguard against a return to Catholic rule and was intended to preserve the newfound religious and political stability that had been established after the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Establishment of a constitutional principle. The Act of Settlement helped solidify the constitutional principle that the English monarchy would be bound by law and subject to parliamentary control. It emphasized the authority of Parliament in determining matters of succession and, by extension, the broader governance of the nation. The transition of power from the Stuart dynasty to the House of Hanover marked a pivotal moment in British history. It occurred following the death of Queen Anne in 1714, as she had no surviving Protestant heirs. The Act of Settlement's provisions were invoked to determine her successor. The direct line of descent led to Sophia of Hanover, a granddaughter of James VI and first through his daughter Elizabeth Stuart. However, Sophia died just weeks before Queen Anne, and the throne passed to her son, George I. George I's accession marked the beginning of the Hanoverian era in Britain. The transition of power was relatively smooth, owing in part to the Act of Settlement's clear provisions and the fact that George I was already well established as the Elector of Hanover. Nonetheless, the change in ruling dynasties was met with varying degrees of acceptance and resistance. George I's arrival in England in 1714 was met with a mixture of reactions. While the Act of Settlement had paved the way for a Protestant monarch, there were still strong pockets of support for the Stuart pretenders, particularly James Francis Edward Stuart, who claimed the throne as James III. These supporters, known as Jacobites, posed a potential threat to the new Hanoverian monarchy. Over time, however, George I's reign saw a degree of stabilization, as he adopted a more moderate stance and worked to build relationships with influential English politicians, particularly the Whigs. His ability to navigate the complexities of English politics and establish a working relationship with his ministers helped solidify his position and reduce opposition. The reign of George I played a pivotal role in the emergence of the prime ministerial system in Britain. While the term Prime Minister had not yet become an official title, this period marked the beginnings of a system in which a single individual, often the head of the ruling political party, held significant influence and authority over the government's executive branch. The relationship between King George I and his prime ministers was instrumental in shaping the political landscape of his era. The king, with his limited command of the English language and his preference for German advisors, often relied on his prime ministers to manage the day-to-day affairs of government. This dynamic had several important consequences. Increased parliamentary power. The king's reliance on the prime minister and the parliamentary majority shifted power away from the monarchy and toward elected representatives. The prime minister and the cabinet became accountable to parliament, marking a significant step toward a constitutional monarchy. Stability in governance. The stability of George I's reign was in large part due to the effectiveness of his prime ministers. Their leadership provided a sense of continuity and direction in government, allowing for the resolution of key issues, such as the South Sea bubble crisis and religious tensions. Transition to constitutional monarchy. The relationship between the king and prime ministers during this period played a crucial role in defining the nature of the British monarchy. It helped establish the principle that the monarch's powers were exercised in accordance with the advice of ministers and that Parliament was the ultimate authority in governance. Religious tensions. Religious divisions persisted in Britain during George I's reign, particularly between Protestants and Catholics. The Act of Settlement, which ensured a Protestant succession, exacerbated these tensions. Efforts to impose oaths of loyalty and conformity further fueled religious disputes. Political factions. The political landscape was divided between the Whigs and the Tories, each with distinct visions of governance. The Whigs, who supported George I, sought to expand parliamentary power, while the Tories were often more conservative and cautious about centralizing authority in Parliament. Jacobite threat. Supporters of the exiled Stuart dynasty, known as Jacobites, posed a persistent threat to the stability of George I's reign. They sought to restore the Catholic James Francis Edward Stuart to the throne, leading to occasional uprisings and conspiracies. Stability. Despite the initial challenges and tensions, George I's reign contributed to a degree of stability in British politics. His pragmatic approach to governance and reliance on the Whigs helped maintain a functional government. Constitutional monarchy. George I's reign played a crucial role in the evolution of constitutional monarchy in Britain. His adherence to the advice of his ministers and the establishment of a more accountable and parliamentary-based system set important precedents for future monarchs. Cultural exchange. George I's German heritage brought a degree of cultural exchange to the British court. This influence can be seen in various aspects of British culture, including music and art, as well as in the architecture of royal residences like Kensington Palace. Foreign policy. George I's reign saw Great Britain navigate its position in European politics. His efforts to maintain alliances and secure peace, as exemplified by the Treaty of Utrecht, contributed to the nation's status as a European power. War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714. This major European conflict was one of the defining events of the early 18th century. It stemmed from disputes over the Spanish throne and involved a complex web of alliances and rivalries among European powers. Britain, under Queen Anne, participated in the war as part of the Grand Alliance, which sought to prevent the unification of the French and Spanish crowns. The war's conclusion had far-reaching implications for British foreign policy. Balance of power. The concept of maintaining a balance of power in Europe was central to British foreign policy during this period. British leaders recognized the need to prevent any single European nation, particularly France or Spain, from becoming too dominant, as this could threaten Britain's security and interests. Rivalry with France. Britain's long-standing rivalry with France continued to shape its foreign policy. The fear of French expansionism and the desire to limit French influence in Europe were key factors driving British involvement in conflicts and diplomatic negotiations. End of the War of Spanish Succession. The Treaty of Utrecht effectively ended the War of Spanish Succession. It recognized Philip V of Spain as the legitimate king but stipulated that the French and Spanish crowns would remain separate. This prevented a union of the two powerful kingdoms. British gains. Britain emerged from the treaty negotiations with significant territorial gains. It acquired important overseas possessions, including Gibraltar and Minorca, which provided strategic control over key Mediterranean sea routes. Balance of power. The treaty aimed to maintain a balance of power in Europe by weakening the Bourbon dynasties of France and Spain. It also recognized the legitimacy of the Protestant Hanoverian succession in Britain, which was critical for George I's position as King of Great Britain. Impact on British foreign policy. The Treaty of Utrecht set a precedent for British foreign policy by emphasizing a balance of power and a focus on securing overseas territories. It also marked the beginning of a period of British involvement in European diplomacy and the pursuit of a global empire. Securing the Protestant succession. George I's foreign policy also aimed at securing the Protestant succession in Britain. This involved diplomatic efforts to ensure that foreign powers recognized and respected the Hanoverian dynasty as the legitimate rulers of Britain. Establishment of constitutional monarchy. George I's reign marked a significant step in the development of constitutional monarchy in Britain. His willingness to delegate power to his ministers and adhere to parliamentary decisions set a precedent for future monarchs. This shift from absolute to constitutional monarchy laid the foundation for a political system in which the monarch's authority was limited by law and the will of Parliament. Strengthening of the cabinet system. The emergence of influential prime ministers, such as Robert Walpole, during George I's reign contributed to the development of the modern cabinet system. The cabinet, as a collective body of government ministers, gained prominence in decision-making, with the prime minister becoming the de facto head of government. Recognition of parliamentary sovereignty. George I's acceptance of parliamentary decisions underscored the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. It affirmed that Parliament was the supreme legal authority in the land, laying the groundwork for the establishment of a democratic and representative system of government. Continued succession. The Hanoverians maintained their hold on the British throne through a series of monarchs, including George II, George III, and so on. Their continued rule contributed to the stability of the British monarchy and the nation's political institutions. Integration into British society. Over time, the Hanoverian monarchs and their descendants became increasingly integrated into British society. They adopted the English language, customs, and cultural norms, which helped bridge the gap between the monarch and their subjects. Preservation of constitutional monarchy. The Hanoverian monarchs, building on the legacy of George I, played a pivotal role in preserving and strengthening the constitutional monarchy in Britain. They upheld the principle of parliamentary sovereignty and the separation of powers between the monarch and Parliament. George I was the first monarch of the House of Hanover, ascending to the throne following the Act of Settlement 1701, which ensured a Protestant succession. His accession marked the transition from the tumultuous Stuart dynasty to the more stable and constitutional Hanoverian era. George I's reign saw the emergence of the prime ministerial system, with influential figures like Robert Walpole wielding significant authority. The Act of Settlement, religious tensions, and political rivalries characterized his rule, with challenges such as the South Sea bubble crisis testing the resilience of the British state. George I's pragmatic approach to governance, reliance on his ministers, and acceptance of parliamentary decisions helped lay the foundation for constitutional monarchy in Britain. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it informative, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more content like this in the future.